Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, our dear attendees. Thank you for joining us today at this, I believe, could be our 13th or 14th weekly webinar by ZICO Law. We started in the middle of March, bringing to you issues, legal issues, business issues with the coming out from the pandemic. Today, as the second edition, we're talking to business leaders. We have with us a CEO, a CFO, and a GC. We're going to start with, I always, kind of believe on ladies first. We'll start with the GC, with Gladys Chen, she's General Counsel and Head of Government Affairs for Lazada Group. She's seen the light. She was with Baker McKenzie Private Practice and then went in-house and have stayed in-house. She is the Financial Times Most Innovative General Counsel Asia Pacific for 2019, and also the GC Power List Southeast Asia for 2019. So this woman is, really making waves and leading one of the most dynamic, I call Lazada a data company, really, rather than a e-commerce or marketplace platform. But I'll let kind of Gladys share with us how things have been with her at Lazada for the last 3 months. I would imagine some interesting stories. One of the industries that's been, I would say, positively impacted by the kind of increase in trade, online business. But let's hear it directly from Gladys. Gladys, over to you.
Thank you, Hanem. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up if you could. Okay, great. Hi, a very good morning, afternoon. I know there are some participants dialing in from different part of the world. I'm Gladys. I think Hanem has given a glorious review of my background. She's being too kind. A little bit of myself. I joined Lazada slightly over 6 years ago when we were, nobody knew us, who we were. I joined Lazada to close a Series B funding round. And then fast forward 6.5 years later, today, I lead a team across Southeast Asia with over 40 people in my legal and compliance team. And I've been very fortunate to be invited to share my experience being part of a very exciting tech company during this extraordinary time. I think the health pandemic has triggered, I would say, a couple of key themes for us in the e-commerce industry. First being the acceleration of digitalization. I think we have seen an increase in the SME onboarding on our platform, where we are growing year on year more than 100%, and we've never seen so many sellers and brands joining our platform. Compared to last year, we have onboarded 8x more sellers every day during this 3 months period. Now, of course, we all know that during this critical period, SME being the backbone of our economy, they are all struggling, right? Struggling to survive and struggling with cash flow. So during this period, what we've done as an organization, together with Alibaba, we've partnered with governments across this region on what we call booster packages. So for example, in Singapore, we've worked with the EDB in booster packages that we will give to our sellers in the form of cash flow optimization in terms of, expedited loans or deferred commission. And internally, we've also launched what we call stimulus packages across all the different countries, where these comprise of giving free access to our sellers in terms of services, delivery, product listing, advertising, and expedited services to help them survive through this period. In addition, on the health pandemic side, together with Jack Ma Foundation and Alibaba Foundation, we've been very fortunate to be able to work with different regulators around this region, where we have donated PPE under our CSR program called Lazada for Good, where we have managed to source for masks and other PPE equipments, where we then get to send to the countries they are clearly lacking in supply. This is quite an interesting piece because when China started the pandemic, it was the reverse. Alibaba was trying to source masks and PPE from outside of China going into China because of a lack of supply. And when things stabilized and the pandemic slowly spread across the rest of the world, we're seeing the reverse, what I call reverse logistics happening, where China now has supply, which can now feed into the demand of the other countries. So it's been quite an experience moving those goods around the world, trying to serve the needs of the people who are affected by this pandemic. I think, of course, during this pandemic situation, with the increase of number of SMEs, we do face challenges. Challenges in the form of lockdown, right? Borders are closed. How do I get my cross-border supplies in when flights are not operating? Even internally, for example, in Malaysia, where the traveling between the states are not permitted, right? And we're trying to make sure that we're able to serve the broader consumer segment as broad as possible based on the location of our key warehouses. But it's not possible if I can't travel between the states. So during this period, we also have to work very closely with regulators in designing what we call essential services delivery. We then have to relook at what we offer for sale on our platform, because the consumer behavior and consumer demand also change over this period, and work with the regulators very closely to ensure that we're able to deliver those needs, essential needs to the consumer. One story that I would like to share on these in these seminar is that in Malaysia, what happened was one of our team saw that a farmer in Cameron Highlands, and Cameron Highlands is famous for fresh vegetables and fruits. They had to throw away 1.5 tons of their vegetables every day because no one is going up to pick and no one is going to buy. So what we've done is over a very short span of time, we've converted the farmer onto Lazada as a seller. And we've designed logistics solutions, and the farmer was able to sell all the produce on our platform. So that was, I would say, a story which really touched my heart, because having this ability to create that impact and help the community during this pandemic and crisis period makes my job very meaningful.
Well done. I think, let me just, sorry, just to cut you there. I think that's another innovative award coming up your way, or at Lazada. I think that's really good, having done, being able to bring forward, I think, technology to the masses in that sense, bring them on. But what are the challenges that you faced during this difficult period, apart from supply and logistics problems?
Yeah, so I think that the key challenges, the other key challenges is manpower, right? So give you an example, when the borders between Singapore and Malaysia were shut, a lot of our warehouse workers are from Malaysia, and some of our delivery drivers are from Malaysia. And I recall we only had 24 hours to decide. And the workers have to decide whether do they stay in Singapore or do they go back to Malaysia with no certainty when the borders is going to be lifted. So what we did there is then we worked with the regulators, and we housed almost 400 workers in a hotel here in Singapore for a period of time to ensure that our warehouse is able to run at the capacity that's required in order for us to deliver essential services to the consumers in Singapore. So manpower has been quite a challenging task for us. And similarly in Philippines, because of the interstate travel restrictions, some of our warehouse workers stay in a different district compared to where the warehouse is located. And they wouldn't be able to travel, right? They'll have to go through different gantry passes, and they have to get special approval, a permit they have to carry with them. And getting that workforce to the location that they need to provide services was quite challenging for us during this period. Of course, the safety of our employee with the social distancing measures is also another challenge, right? Because now we have to reconfigure our warehouse operations to make sure that there is sufficient social distancing measures, and also there are sufficient safety measures in terms of checking their temperature, making sure that there's proper hygiene being practiced in the warehouse, to ensure that we don't create that cluster internally within the organization.
Thank you for that sharing. I think sounds like you will be very busy during this period dealing with all these issues. I will move on to Paul now. Paul is a pricing director at Abbott, here based out of Singapore. I'm also keen. Paul himself has experience, have been in Southeast Asia for I think 20 years, 14 of which being in the medical industry. He's with Abbott Diagnostics, where he implements and delivers TVO models. So Abbott, as we all know, is a large pharmaceutical company, nutrition, and also medical devices. It's located, it's a global company, and in Singapore itself, it's got more than 900 employees. Paul, tell us how has the COVID period or the pandemic, the last 3 months, been for you and your business at Abbott? You need to be unmute, I think, Paul. Okay.
Thank you very much, Haneem, for the introduction. It has been a wild few months, to say the least. Being obviously in the medical industry and being with Abbott, Abbott has 4 pillars of business. The one pillar of business that I'm in is diagnostics. So we have been at the forefront of everything that's happened with the COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at our history, we have a strong history in diagnostics of infectious disease. So then when COVID-19 basically appeared on the world stage, it was all hands on deck in terms of how can we react to that. As I said, part of what we do is testing, but testing in this pandemic is extremely difficult. So the way we've been impacted is trying at the forefront to say, do we have a test? Yeah. How can we get a test out? What test would we get out? And just in terms of where countries are in the cycle, some are still in the midst of this pandemic where they're detecting active infections. Some have moved on from that piece. So that was the whole decision making that we went through as an organization. And one of the things that amazed me was how quickly we managed to go from not having a test on the market to having then multiple tests. Without going into too many specifics on the technical piece, I mean, a lot of the tests will fall into 2 main categories. One would be to detect active infections, and they're typically molecular type tests. And then you have serological tests, which are then used to detect past infections or recent infections. So we've brought out in a very short space of time a number of tests. But with that comes a challenge, I think, of working with governments and working with our commercial labs and our customers to help them develop a strategy for testing, depending on where they are at the different stages of the pandemic. That's probably been the most challenging, because we heard from Gladys. I mean, as this came out and spread across the world, there are some countries that reacted a lot later than others. So in terms of working with them and being able to get in front of those stakeholders as early, many of them, it became very, very acute when they realized there was an impact on their doorstep. So that's, I say, has been the biggest challenge for us, is working with them on developing a testing strategy and showing them what other countries and other customers have done and what has worked and what hasn't.
Thank you. So what have you found kind of effective in terms of communicating with governments and getting, the approvals across? Obviously, you said there were many different providers. I think they were quite challenging for us, the general public. It was also confusing in terms of, does a person need to get tested, or is it that some countries like South Korea had the door-to-door testing? For example, everybody got tested, where we were expecting in Singapore that would be done, but actually it wasn't. It was just kind of, targeted testing. So just generally in terms of this science behind testing, how does one decide, who gets tested and at what point?
I think the most important thing for, say, government once the pandemic breaks is understanding then who has the active disease, and that's just, I think, as we look globally, there's still very much an emphasis on that. Finding out within your population what test would you use to detect an active disease right now. The second piece, as I said, is depending where you are in the active disease, you've got different things that will show early. Yeah, you'll be able to sort of detect the virus early. When you go into sort of serology testing, what that is basically doing is then saying, how does the body react in terms of generating, say, antibodies to fight against that? And there are different types of antibodies, some which will show themselves earlier when you sort of present symptoms or have symptoms, and some which will then, as an antibody called IgG, which will present itself later, and it stays in the body longer, and it can stay for months and up to years if you look at past SARS types events. I think everybody's been asking then, once the antibody appears, does that then suggest immunity? And there's still, I think we're early in the evidence collection cycle to make a determinant on that. But it really has been trying to then move. We have tests in the detection phase, so working with governments and the private sector as well to make sure if that's where they're at just now in the pandemic, that we have that supply of tests to help them through that. Together, we've also found in some cases then using blood tests together with a PCR test which would detect the disease improves the accuracy. So using both tests in tandem will make sure that you don't then allow people to escape from the net and therefore be out in the community. Therefore, obviously, yeah, spreading the disease. That's been, I think, the number one concern by the government, and the number one challenge for us is just cutting through the noise of what is available. I mean, there's over 200 tests available in the US, and the FDA then very quickly came down and said, okay, we're going to exclude certain tests that do not meet our requirement in terms of quality. And it's been that education piece of explaining to people what our tests do, when we would use them, where does the government see themselves in, and working with them to develop a testing strategy that meets their needs.
Yeah, I mean, this morning the WHO also mentioned about airborne. I think that's something that's new that it could, so I will want to come back to you later on in terms of if you could share with us how the developments on the vaccine. I think that's something that everybody's been waiting for, and maybe some comment on that one. But I'll move on to Chris now, is our CEO for today. That's from Savills, a real estate company. A huge real estate company, FTSE 250 company. It's 165 years old, and Chris himself is really an Asian citizen. He's been, in Asia for just more 25 years, telling your age, Chris. And, I met him first when we set up Savills in Indonesia many, many years ago when I was based there. So it's very interesting with what's happening with working from home, and people, even us, ZICO, we're really looking at our leases. Is it time to, scale down? Is it just people are going to continue this behavior? People seem more comfortable because it's, those who are risk averse. All this kind of like question mark for a company like yourself. How has this been impacting you in terms of your business now? How's it going?
Sure, thank you, Hanim. It's now just over 30 years, so I've suddenly got 5 years older, I'm afraid. Look, if I touch on the markets first and then go to the sort of return to office debate, Savills is 27,000 people in Asia Pac. We've probably got 65 offices in 15 countries. So our main concern ourselves has been the 27,000 employees' health and welfare. And they are ranging from sort of the high-end executives doing capital markets and investment through to on-the-ground property managers who have been in demand and active throughout of this, keeping buildings clean, keeping premises clean. But overall, look, the first half of the market was very challenging for the real estate sector. Investment transactions dropped by 45% across Asia Pac. But on a more positive note, as we've returned to work, office demand has actually increased a little. And whilst the investment transactions have dried up a little. There's a lot of dry powder and cashed up local investors and unallocated funds from recent fundraisers by Blackstone, BlackRock, KKR, Allianz, and PAG. So there's a lot of dry capital out there. As we could expect, cross-border activity has slowed due to travel restrictions. But again, that's been positive for the local investors who have come out and been more active and able to pick up product that they've been looking at. We've seen really strong performances from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, all of which have remained open and have significant local capital investors. Interest rates are remaining low, and they look to be low for some time in the future. And a lot of the investors are looking for stable returns. And I think they're finding those stable returns against the risk-free rate, i.e. the local 10-year government bond. And I think that's why places like Tokyo, where you've got near 0% interest rates against 3% yield on real estate, are performing well. Although the yield spreads in places like Sydney and Hong Kong look favorable, they have slightly different stories in terms of their rental outlook. For Sydney, obviously, they've had a difficult period, both with the pandemic, but also prior to that, the bushfires. And also they've got a spectre of a bit of a run-in with the Chinese government, all dampening rental demand. But what I would note is that there's been more difficulty from the investor community trying to get funds from banks, raise debt finance. So I think, again, where there are relationships, where there are cash-rich investors, they will dominate the marketplace. Probably worth saying that one market that's performed extraordinarily well, and a new market in the portfolio has been that of Vietnam. It's not only managed the pandemic very well, but also they've really started to gain from the shift in manufacturing and diversification of supply chain outside of China. And moving away from sort of the geographic view, there's been more resilient in, as you can imagine, logistics driven by e-commerce during the lockdown period, and even prior to that with the deterioration on the high street retail. Healthcare as demand has grown, but also data centers, as we've thrived on Zoom in the daytime and Netflix in the evening. So there's been data centers being very popular for the last 5-10 years, but they seem to have had a little bit of a resurgence. We're also seeing more interest in residential, strange enough, in the living sector. You will have seen that people like Weave have just entered the market here in Singapore with a joint venture with a new funds management group, 32RE. And residential has sort of come out on top as a great store of wealth. Less so than as we say, the sort of investment returns. But Hannah, turning back to your question on what do you do with your lease, how do you occupy your properties? I think it is probably the most debated. If you go onto LinkedIn, it's probably the most debated subject, and the views range from the office is dead to long live the office. So there's a huge diversity, but maybe a little insight. I think it's premature to claim the outright success of working from home as a replacement to the office. Technology has been the real winner, making it easy to communicate. But as countries have opened up and people return to work with split workforces, we're seeing the gains drift. It's not quite so easy to do the Zoom call or the Teams call when part are in office and part are at home. So how do we see it moving forwards? I think top of the priority list is health and well-being. I think any business that ignores that is in danger of getting the wrong side of the labor force. Especially in the Western world, health and well-being in terms of the legal liability is fairly strong. So you don't want to be the cause of an infection in your office for being sued for that case. And that would probably be more in the form of places like Australia than it may be in parts of Asia Pacific. Once we're over this initial hurdle, I think the talk will be on long-term demand, and I think there'll be two forces at play. This will be the need to accommodate social distancing, which will increase demand or increase the need of space. But I think that'll be counterbalanced by a greater prevalence of working from home. And I think that'll be split into two parts. One, all staff, where they work part of their week from home, and part of the staff where they will work completely from home. So I think there will be changes in the way we look at how we work and the way that offices are going to be used.
Thank you. Would you say, there was a trend, I guess, a couple of years, I would say 5 to 8 years on hot desking, kind of open plans, and even WeWork, people you don't have fixed overheads and then instead have places. Do you think that will continue, or because of the social distancing issues, you may not even, hot desking is just something of the past?
Yeah, it's again, debated subject, but what we will find is there'll be a greater integration of the technology team, the real estate team, and the HR team. And we've seen some of the sort of better examples of businesses managing, especially in the financial services industry, where they've had to keep parts of their office open, sort of getting the triumvirate of those teams to work very closely together. I see hot desking continuing, but it will be clean hot desking. So once it'll be managed by an in-house app, you will know which desk you can go to, which has been cleaned. So they'll effectively integrate, as I say, the technology with the property management, with the staff coming into office. And I can see a great deal of tech sort of app construction in that area. So I think we'll see a slew of sort of prop tech initiatives on how to manage desk space. So I think, again, I don't think it'll be the death of the office. I think people need a base. I think, especially in Asia, especially in the markets where you have small residential units and more than one generation living in that unit, places like Hong Kong, it's almost impossible to work from home. So I think it'll be dependent on the market, but we'll see the office come back. There's no doubt about that.
We are now at the halfway mark of this webinar. I would just like to remind our participants, attendees, we have a Q&A function. Please feel free to type in your question and specify to which speaker that you are posing your question to. We'll try to get to them at the end. We've allocated about 10 minutes at the end to get to your question. So please don't be shy and pose your questions to either Gladys, Paul, or Chris. I will now go to Paul on kind of getting his perspective on the vaccines. How's it? Where are we at, or what? I mean, to the point that he can divulge to us and share with us in terms of where Abbott's at on the vaccine.
Because we're in the diagnostic space, we're not actually, what Abbott is not involved in is vaccine creation. So you've heard some names in the news, the Gileads of the world, who are actively sort of bringing out vaccines, and some of them have secured, I think, arrangements with some governments to then supply en masse the entire population. That's not a space, that's not something that Abbott does. So we have pharma. Pharma is one of our 4 pillars. But we won't create a vaccine for COVID. One thing we are looking at with our customers is, again, once a vaccine does come, the optimists are saying end of the year. Others, again, best guess is probably early next year. What does a vaccine strategy look like then for a government? The demand for the vaccine is going to be enormous. What is the supply constraints on that vaccine coming out? So again, if you look at that vaccine strategy together with a serology test strategy, if you've already tested a portion of your community and you know that a portion of the community already have developed an antibody response, and say even, for example, we have the evidence in that it could suggest immunity, then that would put, I think, governments and even on the private sector in a position to then, where do they divert? Who do they go after first with that strategy? Who's the most at risk? I think that's a play for the serology testing, working together with when a vaccine comes out. What we're looking at specifically with, I mean, as things progress and we I think we're working under the assumption that COVID is going to be around for a period of time. Yeah. So the new norm, so to speak, then what does that look like? Does testing just become part of the regular testing when you go to your GP? Yeah, if you're feeling unwell, you have a bit of the sniffles, you have a fever, if you go there, is your GP just going to prescribe a COVID-19 test together with the regular suite of blood tests that come out? Part of that, again, we've got flu season, which is around the corner. What does that look like? When that comes again, are we working with the right people to make sure that serology testing allows us to identify when flu season comes out, who's most at risk? Yeah, if you look at your frontline workers, if they have been tested and they've demonstrated an antibody response, yeah, again, on that immunity side, whether that evidence comes in, armed with that information allows you to say, well, who goes where better? You've got more information to say, do I allow the frontline workers to return? If 50% of the frontline workers haven't actually had it, they remain the most at risk. So I think that lets sort of the hospitals, the care homes, the governments then look at what would be that strategy to allow people to return to work. What would a surveillance type project look like in terms of who would they test? Because unfortunately, COVID-19 is not, it's an unequal virus. Yeah, it attacks different parts of society unequally. There are certain ethnic groups that are more at risk, the elderly, people that have pre-existing conditions. So it is important that I think the governments understand where they stand with different parts of their communities in terms of what they have. Armed with that information, when the vaccine does come, I think will help them make the best decisions.
In terms of innovation that's coming out from this pandemic, you know, kind of trends or maybe health tech or any other trends, maybe you can share with us. One of the questions from, we've got a question from Rachel in terms of what would you predict to be a long-lasting, far past the pandemic into the future in terms of industry, in terms of trends that may continue. What have you seen? Could you share with us, Paul?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it is very much country dependent as well, but we've seen them. If I take an example of Australia, so we've seen prior to COVID coming along, when people went to the GP, there was about 1% of GP consultations that were done remotely using the internet, using Zoom or any other medium. That's risen to between 20 and 25%. So as people are afraid of, perhaps stepping outside the front door, moving into a hospital setting, which they may perceive to be a higher risk, they're using the power. So telemedicine has really taken off in those countries where we've seen the accessibility available. I think that will continue. Might not continue the 20-25% rates, but I think there's a good chance that will come down, and that the new norm might be somewhere around 10 to 15%. So again, how do the GPs react to that? How does the wider healthcare infrastructure react to that diagnosis then being done remotely? Whereas we're so used to in the past sitting across the table from the GP and having that done one-on-one, and then the GP making the prescription, whether it be on testing or something else. That's one key thing I've noticed. Another one that comes back, I think, just to the earlier discussion of how the industry has reacted. I think we'll see people in the companies a lot more nimble in their responses to developing tests. Yeah, we've seen, say, big 6 companies react and bring out a test in a time span that would normally take them, months, if not years, and they've managed to do this in the space of weeks. So I think that is going to help us obviously a long time in the future, and it might have just an impact, an ongoing impact on the way we approach R&D, the way we approach the team setting of those functions, to allow, I think, the industry to be more on the front foot and not have these longer time lags between the actual production and then bringing to market of a new product.
Well, that brings, I mean, as a lawyer, immediately bells come up in terms of regulation and, you know, making sure if you're getting diagnosis over the internet, over the telephone, getting proper license and getting proper approvals and things like that. What are your thoughts in terms of security measures? That, you know, are we there in terms of online with the growth of telehealth and digital healthcare business?
No, I don't think we're there yet. I mean, I think we've seen too many examples over the past 12 months, 24 months, where there's been and continues to be a number of security breaches with big data. I mean, the importance of using it in something like a pandemic is crucial, that you get access to that information, the whole track and trace element of it, being able to quickly go in and identify clusters. And those clusters, again, geographical clusters, but also amongst different ethnic groups. So I think the use and the power of it is enormous. But as you mentioned, Taneem, I mean, that element of security remains critical. So when we bring this up and we have our own servers, we have the ability to then go and use our instruments to again detect and bring out the information that's coming from the laboratory information systems. A real concern from our customers and governments is, again, yeah, what information are you storing? How is that going to be used? The flip side, I think, of it is just what is that happy medium, because everyone sees the potential of using that data to then better help them control, I think, especially a pandemic situation. But also, I think it leaves itself open to discussion then on things like artificial intelligence, and later down the line, how do you start to use that in the medical industry? One other thing I've just actually mentioned, just on the regulatory side, I mean, the speed at which these products have been brought out has forced many governments to change the way they look at it from a regulatory standpoint. Yeah. The positive of it has been the speed at which some of these have been brought out. The negative, again, as I mentioned earlier, you have 200 tests available in the market. Not all of them, I would say, fit for purpose. So how do you strike that balance between, in a pandemic situation, being able to bring those products out as quickly as you can, but at the same time provide assurances to the population, to the clinicians, to the wider community that, yeah, we're not compromising on quality.
Yeah, it's a tough one, balance to strike. Thank you, Paul. I'll go back to Chris now. He's shared a lot of his thoughts about trends, but if you're advising a landlord, or you know, yeah, let's go with the landlord first, and then we advise the tenant. What would be the top 3 things that you will tell the landlord that he needs to do for his business?
I think split that in 2 parts. One is the physical aspect. A lot of the mainstream landlords have been working very hard to make sure that their properties are easy to enter, but also secure in terms of medical, the health checks that are required of them. And you'll have seen photos again around the press about cleaning things like escalator handles and buttons, and so I think there's been a huge amount of effort put into that. In terms of the financial side, which I think the question was more directed at, I think let's deal with the office market. I think the retail market is slightly separate from this conversation, but in the office market, most landlords are looking to retain tenants regardless of the overall portfolio. So the question on rent relief, I think, is the first question that people have been asking. Most have not given rent relief. They will look at the state of financial affairs of a company, but obviously trying to save the drowning man is always a dangerous process. So where the weak covenants are starting to fail, I think they'll probably take a more brutal approach to it and look to reletting that space. Where they have larger companies, they're obviously less inclined to be giving rental relief to them. Where we have seen them take a very positive stance is with tenants who are partway through fit outs. And certainly in markets that have been locked down and the construction industry has been closed, they have normally given the bulk of the lockdown period as an extension to the fit out. That said, it only covers part of the delay. Most sites, as they come out of lockdown period, probably only get 10 to 30% of the labour force back on site. So there's even delays after the construction recommences on site. For the tenant community, everybody has put their hands up and said, I've not been able to occupy my offices. I need a rent rebate for the time that I've not been in my office. I think, fair call, but again, And I think we've been working with many tenants to try and get rent relief. But as I say, it's not an easy process to get that rent relief. Where I see the real sort of difficulty for landlords is markets where there is an increase in supply coming through and that they have to lease speculative space into the market. There's a lack of cash in the corporate coffers, or there's more conservative approach to cash in the corporate coffers, and I don't see people willingly do fit outs, cash hungry fit outs. So I think the new lettings market will slow unless the landlords come in and give higher incentives and inducements for tenants to move into that space. So I see that as being one area where the market will be frustrated.
You also have governments allowing for non-eviction anyway for people who are not paying rent. So I think that's a bit difficult for landlords. I see that in Singapore.
Yes. So but the bulk of my work over the past 3 months has been sorting problems out. And basically they range from delayed fit outs through to exactly that can we use the clauses to frustrate and negotiate? I think on the retail side, I think it's absolutely fair. We've got a community of retailers that have stopped trade, and most landlords have been sympathetic and given rent relief to those tenants. So as I say, I think it's very much dependent on the sector and what's happened in that sector. But I think there have been many messages sent by different governments, whether it be the Australians or the Singaporeans, that have put tenants into a bit of confusion in terms of what they can use to frustrate or negotiate a new rent with. So as I say, most of my time has been taken up mediating to find the point of maximum disappointment between both parties, where both party is equally disappointed by the result.
Leaning on your 30 years plus of wisdom, I'm sure. There's a question on, will hotels be repurposed, you think?
Yeah, ironically, the hotels market, we're expanding hotels and retail services in terms of consultancy work. It's the one where I see the most activity. It's that sort of running into the burning house. There is the most stress in retail, retail commercial property, and also hotels and hospitality. I think we've already seen the wave of retail shopping centres moving towards more F&B and becoming more of a community location where people go not just to shop but to eat and to meet, and that's being driven by e-commerce. Hotels, I think, is going to be a long-term struggle until free movement returns. So whether they get repurposed, there needs to be the demand for that. But again, I think we're going to see some real stress and some great opportunities appear.
Very good. I think one more on the tenant side. If I'm a tenant looking into having to move into or commit to a long term, or what would your advice be? Would it be just keep it to 3 years, or you can go longer? What kind of specific asks that you could ask for committing?
Adam, that's a really, really good question, and there are some active negotiations in the Asia Pac region where tenants have now said, look, I want to commit to a long-term piece of space and normally to amortize their fit out. Let's talk about a larger tenant rather than a small agile tenant. Basically, those large tenants are saying, look, we do want a headquarters location that we can identify with, that our clients and our staff can identify with. But we've seen this huge amount of uncertainty, whether it's driven by technology, whether it's driven by a pandemic, whether it's driven by just change in the way we do business. What's happening because of that is that they're asking for more flexible aspects to their space. So they may say, we can commit 60% of the space required on a long-term 10-year lease, but we would like 30% on a flex solution, or enterprise solution as they're called, plus 20% of the space on a total turn on, turn off as and when we need it. So I think we're going to see that sort of evolution, and we've seen it down in Australia with Dexus now offering a 3-tier lease with sort of core space, enterprise space, and flex space. So I think we'll see that sort of coming out into the marketplace over the next couple of years.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Going back to Gladys now on the consumer demand. I think Southeast Asia as a region, it's a very robust region with kind of middle class growth and active buying power. What are your thoughts in terms of people continuing to shop online rather than going out to the high street?
Thanks, Hanif. I think indeed the online shopping trend is definitely going to stay beyond the pandemic. I think the pandemic has really accelerated the growth of e-commerce, or rather the entire digitalization journey for a lot of people in Southeast Asia. I think looking forward, one of the common trends is really online engagement. And as more people spending time indoors, and people are more conscious about having contact, right, with people. So the mode of delivery will also change from, today a lot of the places already incorporate contactless delivery. There is also going to be more digital engagement as people spend more time. I particularly enjoy, when Chris shared about the data center demand, where people are Zooming on the day and Netflix on the night, which drives up the demand for a data center. I think likewise for us, we have seen an increase in terms of consumer engagement module. So there are more KOL-like features being built into our app. So for example, we have Last Life, where now we have a lot of KOLs that all of a sudden, or rather a lot of sellers all of a sudden become overnight KOLs, right? Because that's the only avenue that they have to interact with their consumers. And we also inbuilt a lot of what we call shoppertainment strategy. In today's world, all of us, our time spent is limited, and we want to enjoy what we do, right? Including shopping for items online. So today, what we've done is that we combine shopping with entertainment by leveraging technologies such as augmented reality for you to try lipsticks or dress. And also gamification in our in-app features. So we've launched Guess It, we've launched Last Game, we've also launched a See Now, Buy Now in-app purchase. So for example, if we have a campaign with a particular fashion brand, for example, and as you see the model walk down the virtual runway, you can buy the product that the model is wearing, right, without being physically there. So the way that the shift in the consumer behavior and how they've engaged with platforms has changed dramatically over the last 3 months. I would say it's expedited the process, but I do foresee that this trend will continue. Where more and more consumption of media content are taken online. And that brings itself a different trend which corresponds to that shifting in consumer behavior, which is really supply chain diversification. How do you enhance your logistics capability as well as payments capability? I think today we are very lucky to be in a region where we're seeing a very high growth in terms of the overall payment landscape and also a digital journey. So there'll be more focus on local sellers, local produce, given the disruption that we've seen from the recent pandemic, where imported products we're finding it more difficult to come onshore. So there's a lot more motivation to drive local brands, local products, and local produce. And that needs to be coupled with the right cross-border strategy, because at the end of the day, there's no one single country that can produce everything in the world, right? So one will need to think about how they match their local needs versus cross-border supply in order to find the optimal structure. Also, as all of us are working from home, we're all consumers here in this webinar. Our demand for goods has also changed. I think from e-commerce perspective, we're seeing initially when the pandemic broke out, there is this huge spike in health and safety product, obviously. And then we see FMCG's product, gaining traction. Then we see people are getting a bit bored at home, so we see a lot of electronics, gaming, and then we realized that all of a sudden everyone became chef. So there's a huge uptick in kitchenware. Everyone is baking the burnt cheese at home. But of course, those are the categories that we see an uptick because of the changing behavior in our lifestyle. But corresponding, there's also downwards trend, right? For example, fashion. We're not going to be, wearing your beautiful dresses at home. And I'm sure for most of us today, it's the first time we are wearing our work clothes for the purpose of this webinar. So we do see that, categories like fashion and furniture will be quite challenging. And this translate back to how would these sellers survive if that is their only assortment for their shop, right? So we encourage our sellers to adopt diversification strategy in order for them to weather through the different storms that's going to come in the future. So that's also been quite a learning experience for us and our sellers on the platform.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think on hindsight, I guess you could say if you had that foresight before, what will people be buying, then you can supply, then you can ahead of
Nintendo Switch. I wish I would have bought them before, bought them in bulk in Japan, because the price is definitely double.
There's a question, in fact, for Paul here, what's about, I think, crystal ball gazing on a prediction of a pandemic. Paul, would you care to even attempt to that question? What's the chance of another pandemic in the scale of COVID-19 in the next decade or two?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the chance of another pandemic within the next 20 years, I think is high. I think if we just look at the way society operates just now with the global connectivity that we have, whether it be on the social front or the business travel front, we're more connected. We've got more freedom of movement than we've ever had before, which makes the conditions right for a virus being able to then move from one location across the world very, very quickly. I think that will be interrupted, obviously, short term. Borders are closed in many countries, so that will have an impact. But as borders do reopen, I think it just lends itself, unfortunately, to a situation where we will see a repeat. And obviously, we need to learn as much from current pandemics to make sure we're better prepared.
Yeah, I think Melbourne today is on lockdown again. They're going through a second lockdown. A lot of people talk about a V or a W recovery because of, second waves. I think there was once Bloomberg said it was a swoosh, a Nike swoosh, but I think it's early days, especially in the United States. It's still, kind of quite problematic. There's a question here on small business owners. How do they cope? I think Gladys have answered that in terms of diversifying their offering. Any other tips apart from diversifying? Because it's not easy if you're just supplying. In the past, you're very focused on doing one thing and doing it really well, and then having to kind of suddenly come up with another product. I think it may not be so, agile to be able to do that quickly.
I think all these speakers today have touched on the survival tips, right? Is really being agile and flexible. I think historically, when we have a big sellers who only produce a particular product for the longest time, they find that they have to change their supply chain procurement strategy overnight because of the demand from the consumer has shifted significantly. And also try to identify what does the consumer need during this time, right? And you can repurpose some of your existing, for example, manufacturing facilities to cater for the new demand, right? And the ability to continuously disrupt your own business model, that's quite critical. Because we're seeing that the consumer behavior and the consumer demands are changing even month from month. And all of a sudden you see, hey, how come this product is selling like hotcakes? And then when you try and understand what motivated that change in behavior, then you realize that, hey, the entire market is shifting towards a new direction. So diversification, ability to remain agile and flexible in switching or optimizing your current asset that you have to repurpose into something that's relevant, which the consumer will buy, coupled with I would say KOL kind of marketing that would really help to spread the awareness and help the sellers to survive during this period.
Thank you. We've got another just 4 minutes to the hour. I'm just going to go around quick question to all three of our panelists, first to Chris and then to Gladys. In terms of, on hindsight, is there anything that you would do differently, knowing what we've been through this journey of COVID-19? Just short answers. Chris, anything to do differently?
I wish we had more technology. Very simple.
You'd invest it earlier on.
Yeah, we as it was, we launched Teams into 3,000 office-based staff within the business in a 2-week period. So I suppose in a negative way, we didn't have enough technology. In a positive way, we've launched more technology in the last 2 months than we have done in the last 2 years.
Okay. Paul?
Contingency planning. I think some companies, governments have done that. I don't think you can ever get enough. You'll see arguments, can you properly put together a contingency plan for something like we are witnessing right now? But because of the whole impact it's had on every sector, every industry, logistics, bringing products in, I think that's probably one area where, I would have liked to see more activity globally.
Yeah, business owners out there, do your stress tests, so kind of like and check. Yeah, Gladys.
Yeah, I think for us is I wish that we could have developed things quicker and faster and able to scale a lot quicker. Because today we're seeing a lot of gaps in the society in their digitalization journey. And if I could, and I've had the budget to build.
You do. You have Alibaba behind you.
Yeah. That would be something that I wish that we could have done a lot earlier, right? The ability to build a scalable solution much faster.
Yeah, but then you also mentioned earlier, then we see the problems of supply chains and getting things across as well. Sometimes when borders are closed, you're just stuck. You can't get things across, no matter what you invest. I guess it's not easy, right?
Agree. But there are still opportunities that's untapped, right? Because of these, during this crisis, you will realize that, hey, all this while we've just been adopting Model A, whereas actually Model B works just fine, and we don't have to invoke all these complicated solutions that we thought we need for Model A. So it's how do you turn that crisis into opportunities? I'm sure a lot of the people on the call would had to ask themselves that questions, right?
Yeah. Thank you. We are at 12 o'clock. I would like join me attendees to thank Chris Marriott, CEO of Savills, Southeast Asia. We have Paul Clark from Abbott, and also Gladys Chen of Lazada. Thank you for joining us today. I hope for the questions that we weren't able to tackle, we'll try to get in touch. We'll leave your email. We'll get them across to you, the answers, as soon as we can. This recording will be posted into our COVID-19 resource hub at the ZICO Group website. If you go to ZICO Group/COVID-19 Resource Hub, you'll see a slew of different past webinars and articles that will help you during this period. ranges from force majeure clauses to employee obligations to market assessments from the 10 countries and 18 offices that ZICO law has across ASEAN. So thank you again for joining us. Join us again next week, Wednesday, for our next round of webinar. Please stay tuned to the announcements and the emails, that invitation that you receive. Thank you.